Hello, sixth graders. So we are going to be reading the book called Half a World Away. It is by Cynthia Kadohata. Here we have R.J. Palacio. He's the author of Wonder, and he recommended this book as well. I'm going to read you the back of it, and then we'll get started on the first chapter. Electricity, the flowing of electromagnetic particles. It creates lightning, turns on the TV, generates power. A microscopic current, something we cannot see that connects us all. The concept fascinates 12-year-old Jaden, but what he can't understand is this. He doesn't feel connected to anyone, so he lights fires, hoards food, steals, runs until his anger beats him to the ground. His biological mother didn't want him, and while his adoptive parents say they love him, Jaden feels nothing. Or something, actually, like an epic fail. And now they want to adopt a new kid, so they pack up and fly with Jaden halfway around the world to get one. In Kazakhstan, Jaden's smoldering anger flares. He knows what will happen next. Or does he? All right, so now we have our little bit of the summary. We're going to get started on the first chapter. Chapter 1. Jaden sat on the floor, holding on to a half loaf of unsliced bread. He switched his lamp on and off, the bedroom lighting up and darkening over and over. Electricity had always relaxed him. For sure, it was the most amazing thing about America. He bit off the biggest chunk of bread that could fit in his mouth. It was sourdough, which he liked because it was so chewy. On, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. Thomas Edison had called electricity a system of vibrations. Jaden loved Thomas Edison. Edison had more than 1,000 U.S. patents. He had invented things left and right. Jaden wouldn't hate life like he often did, if only he could invent that much. He mostly wanted to invent anything related to electricity. Atoms were in constant motion, even when you were asleep. When you died, your personal electricity kind of turned off. And yet, everything on the earth held constantly moving atoms. So even if your personal electricity died, your body still had a system of vibrations. Jaden hadn't figured it all out yet, but he would someday. He'd promised himself that. He closed... Sorry, guys. He closed his eyes and stayed very still, concentrating on his electricity. He could feel a slight tingling in his hands. He hadn't even known what electricity was when he was first adopted from Romania 4 years earlier. In Romania, he'd lived in 4 different group homes, and none of them had electricity. Anyway, here he was at 12, and now his adoptive so-called parents were adopting another child, a baby boy from Kazakhstan. He figured he knew why they were adopting again. They weren't satisfied with him. Whenever he thought that, he felt tears welling up. He didn't know if he was upset for himself because they weren't satisfied with him, or for the baby because if the baby was up for adoption, it meant that the mother had abandoned him, and Jaden knew what that was like. The baby's name was Bazitsan. In his picture, he appeared Central Asian, and he had scabs on his forehead. From bugs? That's how Jaden had gotten scabs on his face when he lived in Romania. Steve, his dad, had made 3 copies of the Bazitsan picture, one for himself, one for Penny, and one for Jaden. Jaden kept his copy in a drawer in his night table. Off. He sat in the dark. He could hear Penny calling him. He called her mom to her face and Penny in his mind. He only had one mother, and she had given him away when he was 4. He could still remember her vaguely, but what he really remembered was the home where she had placed him. 12 people, 1 room, 1 bed. He had slept on the floor, and he remembered being afraid. When his mother left him, he had been so out of his mind that he hadn't even screamed and cried. He had howled. He could still remember the feeling when he'd howled, the feeling like someone was cutting through his skull and pulling out his brain, all while he was awake. Even today, sometimes he was in so much pain about it that he thought it would kill him. He did admit that his home in America was different, and yes, better than anywhere he had lived in Romania. And yet, he always came back to how Romania was his true home and how Penny and Steve had had no right to take him from there. One of his psychologists had told him he should be grateful to Penny and Steve. The shrink didn't understand that they didn't adopt him for him, but for themselves. But what the guy really didn't understand was that it was impossible for Jaden to feel grateful for anything ever. It wasn't personal to Penny and Steve. Jaden had a distaste for parents in general. And he knew he wasn't alone. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of kids in America just like him, adopted when they were older, hating their new parents. He knew this because one of his psychologists or psychiatrists had said so. He couldn't remember at the moment which doctor it was, so he pretty much was just nothing special. "Knock, knock," Penny said from behind him. He turned around, saw her shadow in the doorway. "I'm ready, Mom." They were going out to eat with Penny's older sister, Catherine, and her family. Things could have been worse for Jaden. He could have been adopted by Catherine. Yuck. He let the bread slip from his fingers so Penny wouldn't see that he had been eating before dinner. He got up and followed her through the house. It was a nice enough house, but not his house. He didn't have a house. Never had. He'd only thought he had one. His mother, the only person he figured he had ever loved, had given him up. He refused to feel love again, ever. Every day, all he wanted to do was cry. He hated school, sitting there like a soldier in the army. He hated home, with Penny always trying to get through to him. He wished she would ignore him more. Steve had just gotten home from work, so he was wearing a suit and tie. His suits were all slightly too small because he had gained weight recently. "I hear you didn't go to school. What you been up to all day?" Steve asked Jaden. Packing," Jaden lied. Steve took off his wire glasses, cleaned them, and gazed at Jaden like he wanted to see him better. "It's unbelievable, isn't it? In 48 hours or so from now, we'll be in Kazakhstan meeting your baby brother." Steve smiled. Jaden looked at Steve's face. The smile looked real, not phony the way Steve's smiles sometimes looked. Steve used to be a smiling, lovable geek, but he'd changed. That is, Jaden had changed him. "Yeah, cool." It was raining, so the three of them sprinted out the door to the car. Jaden always sat in the middle of the back seat so that if someone came from one side and tried to pull him out to take him to a foster home or wherever, he would have a better chance of getting away out the other side. That was only a theory, of course, but he believed it. He saw Penny and Steve meet eyes, and then Steve started the car and said, "When we get Bazet-san, we'll need to put the baby seat in the middle. That's where experts say it's safest." Jaden didn't even answer. He couldn't sit on a side, period. "Well, I won't ride in the car anymore," he said. "I'll ride my bicycle everywhere." Sorry, guys. He felt bitterness well up inside himself, moving up from his stomach to his mouth, and he gagged slightly. He knew he was overreacting, but he couldn't help it. Steve and Penny met eyes again. Penny turned all the way around. "Jaden, it's just that Steve read an article saying that baby seat should be in the middle, okay?" So, this was all Steve's idea. Jaden didn't answer. He shook off the bitterness and stared out the side window at the rain falling hard on front lawns, at porch lamps lighting up the houses. It was hard to believe that this lit-up neighborhood existed on the same planet he'd lived on before. If he decided to go to college, he would study electricity, which he'd done a science project on at school. He'd hooked up a cocoon so that a tiny light would go on every time the future moth moved inside the cocoon. Then, when it was born, a bell would ring. He'd gotten his only A ever on that project. He didn't get an A for the class, though. He got a C. That was because the only thing that interested him was electricity. Jaden knew it didn't make sense, but he felt like if his real mother could have had electricity, if she could have only plugged in a light and turned it on, she wouldn't have had to give him away. He told this to one of his former psychiatrists, a man whose name he couldn't remember, and the psychiatrist had said, had asked, "Why do you think that, Jaden?" "Because electricity is magic," he answered. That same psychiatrist was the first of many to say that Jaden couldn't attach properly to Steve and Penny because of being betrayed by the one caretaker he'd ever had, his mother. From age 4 to 8, he'd had to fend for himself in group homes. "I kind of wish I hadn't let Catherine talk me into the dinner date," Penny was saying. "We've got so much to do before we leave." "I, too, wish you hadn't let her talk you into it," Steve replied. "I, too," was exactly the kind of thing Steve said. Perhaps for maybe, distressed for upset, and so on. He was a word nerd. Catherine was kind of strange because she was so different from Penny. Jaden had to admit that Penny was a nice person. He just didn't love her. But Catherine was less than nice. Much less. But Penny refused to see this because of the importance of family. The importance of family was one of Penny's themes. Penny told him that the more family who loved him, the better. Jaden didn't even know for sure what anyone meant when they used the word love. Was it like an electrical charge that developed between two people? He didn't know. All right, guys, that was our first chapter. Sorry about the interruptions from Sully. Look for the questions to answer about this first chapter. I will be posting more videos for chapter 2. Thank you.